So thanks, Tracy. Hopefully I'll be doing more than acting as chief economist this afternoon, but you all will be the judge of that. I want to spend a few minutes putting in context what we've seen occurring in the global economy over the past roughly decade or so, and how it has set a stage for the kinds of changes that we're now seeing. This is really a long-term view. I'm not really going to focus too much on this week or this month or this quarter, but to try to set a much broader context and provide hopefully some insight as to where we think we're seeing opportunities roll out over a period of time. I'm going to try to do this within the allotted time and save a few minutes at the end for any questions. So be thinking about your questions, and I'll be pleased to argue, debate, or answer your questions at the end. So let me begin by sharing with you a bit of history. Let's think from a historic perspective. Our view has been now for a number of years, and it's been quite successfully used, I think, both in the economic outlook and in strategy, that we're now in the fifth epoch of the Industrial Revolution, which has, of course, as you know, lasted over 250 years. Why that's helpful is because it helps us place in time the events that we've been seeing over the course of the past several years. Over several decades, each one of these epochs goes through a somewhat reasonable progression of events. Each one begins where technology is installed. And when we talk about installation, we're talking about just the basics of the technology. Think about the use of computing technology over the past several decades. Very, very basic computing that's been done. But now we've entered into an era where the technology is what we have termed being deployed. It's being baked into, deeply ingrained into business processes, how we do business, how we consume services as consumers and as business people. And you'll also notice in each one of these epochs, intervening has been a very, very significant crash in the financial markets. Now, there are, of course, hundreds of crashes in the financial markets over the course of 250 years, but there have been 5 or so quite large and significant ones, and they each have come at a particular point in time when the balance sheets of households, corporations, and financial institutions need to be cleansed of the bad assets that have been accumulated and prepared for the growth in the period ahead. And each one of these periods also opens up an opportunity for new technology. And it's quite interesting that we have some recently available data that really quite nicely depicts the innovation that occurs during each one of these time periods. The bluish bars on the chart represent 4 of the 5 great crashes in the financial markets. And you can see that the very, very strong and important wave of innovation occurs in and around the same time. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a causal factor, but it is important that the innovation that becomes available is in place as financial circumstances get cleaned out and we're able to move forward in a period of strong growth. To illustrate this in a bit more of a concrete fashion, let me take an example of what occurred here in the US in the 19th century, but you'll see it certainly applies to Western Europe as well. And you see on the chart there, towards the left-hand side of the chart, the 19th century, there was a very strong wave of innovation that then created an enormous period of growth. The textile industry was at the leading edge of technology in the 19th century. It was a real luxury to be able to have more than one suit of clothes because, of course, everything had to be done by hand. The invention of the power loom was the technology of the era. And you may immediately associate the power loom with the Luddites, those who were objecting to the introduction of automation into the manufacturing process. But the benefit of this technology is that over the course of the 19th century, weavers' earnings more than doubled, while at the same time, the price of new technology, of the clothing as a result of the new technology, fell by 98%. Enormous increase in value was created. A substantial portion of it was captured by the workers. Now, it didn't all happen right away. Initially, skilled talent, particularly young women coming in out of the agricultural sector, working with the power looms, increasing their skills over time, increasing productivity as more and more technology was introduced, to the point where, after the Civil War, demand became enormous for clothing and apparel, because, of course, prices had fallen so much that at that point in time, North America was beginning to be covered by the rail network. Notice the word network. A network enters into every one of these stories. The rail network allowed for broad distribution of products across the continent, and the demand for workers rose to such an extent that labor had to be imported. Immigrants arrived, immigration, so another word that we hear a lot about that enters into the story, to fulfill the demand for labor. Wages rose, employment rose, and standards of living increased considerably. Much the same occurred, of course, in Western Europe, but it's interesting to see some of the similarities between the dynamics of economic change today and what we saw in the 19th century, and we could tell a similar story for each one of these epochs as they have occurred. There are similarities, they're certainly not identical. In our current period, we have the benefit of quite significant economic data. So let me share with you a view of the most recent period. When we look at the growth of the capital stock in the United States, at the end of the 1940s, we began to see an enormous increase in the physical capital, physical and intellectual capital being put in place. And that growth of the capital stock continued at quite, I was going to say alarming, quite vigorous rates through the 1960s into the early 1970s, began to slow a bit, and then, of course, in the more recent decades, has slowed quite considerably. Of course, having gone through the great crash of 2008 and 2009 and preparing the financial structure for renewed growth, we in fact see on the right-hand side of the chart that we've turned the corner and begun to see a bit of a recovery. Now remember that the period that we're in now, the most recent 10 years, we're just about to set a record for the longest expansion in economic history. The period we're in now has been the slowest growth in an expansion or recovery period on record. So we've turned the corner, but we've turned the corner at a very, very slow rate and only now beginning to see some acceleration. We can zoom in and you can see, you get a sense of how much slowing occurred over prior decades, creating a lot of the stresses and strains that we feel today and have begun to see the turnaround. I assert one of the fundamental factors here that is driving all of this is the increasing age of both the physical and the intellectual capital stock that is in place today. You can see the age of capital equipment, and intellectual property in the U.S. reached a peak in the late 40s, got renewed through this process down through the 60s and 70s, and is now aged quite considerably since then, and is bare. You have to really squint on the right-hand side of the chart to see what looks like maybe a little bit of topping out in a beginning of a turnaround with a new capital stock having been put in place. So these are some of the fundamental dynamics that have set the stage for the transformation that we're seeing. Now, of course, there have been two other very important changes that have really dominated the transformation of the global economy. One, of course, is the re-entry of China into the global economy. We here in the West, we think about China as being relatively new to have such an active participation in the global economy. The Chinese have a completely different view, right? They were the world's leading global economy for 1,000 years, have had 150 years of hard time, but now returning to their rightful place in terms of their strength and position in the global economy. Very, very different playing field that we're seeing today than we saw in the past, just at a time when we're seeing the underlying economic dynamics of human and physical capital going through a significant change as well. The second very important shift that's occurring are the demographics, the aging population. Not only here in the US, which of course the US in some respects is a little bit better off from a demographic point of view than Western Europe, Western European countries, Russia, even Japan and China, aging populations. So very different mix of labor force skills and requirements, experience levels over the years, and of course going forward. So what has all this meant? What I'm asserting is that a lot of what we've seen with the very powerful dynamics that have been occurring over the course of the most recent decades, the re-entry of China, the changing demographics, have been a very strong contributing factor to the political realignment that we're currently seeing. We see it every day in the press, not only here in the US, but all across Europe and across Asia as well. The difficulty that many households and families have experienced in terms of being able to continue to grow their standard of living, their improved levels of income, their movement ahead, generation after generation, has contributed to the pressure to realign not only the way we practice politics, but the demands and the requirements as well. And a lot of the realignment, again, I assert, is coming about as a result of issues related to income inequality, seeing the shifts that have occurred as the changes in our functioning of the underlying infrastructure have rolled out over time. We've also seen, of course, recently, in fact, in the media and in the press as we speak, the radical redesign that's underway of global supply chains. I'm sure many of you are deeply involved in much of this activity, looking at what the options are and what the future will hold in terms of how product gets to market. And finally, we see very significant shifts occurring from a policy point of view, certainly related to the supply chain issue, the notion that tariffs would play a role in restructuring global commerce. Whether that succeeds or fails, we'll likely have a new and a different set of institutions being put in place over time, replacing the importance and the significance of those institutions that were put in place in the previous period, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. All of the experience that has been gained over the years in improving fiscal and monetary policy management, trade policy, all of those lessons learned are in the past, and a new set of actions and policies and institutions are now will be beginning to appear, and that's in part what we're seeing here, both in the US and in the UK and in other nations as well. So, very substantial transformation, not only of global economic activity, but the implications that it has had in changing the culture, changing society, and changing our politics. Now, the good news is, going through this massive transformation, we've begun to see some positive outcomes. One is the revival of productivity. We would all agree that productivity growth is important. It contributes to growth in income, not only of corporations, but also of workers. And what we've seen recently is that the revival of productivity, quite interestingly, and perhaps somewhat surprisingly, has been led by large non-financial corporate organizations who have been able to innovate, take the kinds of actions that you all have spent 2 days discussing, and begin to implement them for much more effective business outcomes. And not only do we have data at the macroeconomic level, but we have pretty good data at the micro level as well. And you can see on the chart on the right that if we go back 20 years, the solid blue bars, we can see that the non-technology sector actually had more of a leadership role in deploying new productivity-enhancing measures. Think about the creation of Walmart and the improved distribution networks in the retail space. Think about organizations like Charles Schwab in the financial sector, being able to create a fundamentally new business model. So the new business models that were being created 20 years ago, beginning to be implemented by large incumbent organizations, have now carried over in the present period to the kinds of implementations that we've seen in the technology industry. We all know what they are. We've seen Apple create a fundamentally new way of consuming entertainment. Google create a fundamentally new way of tying the needs of buyers to the needs of sellers and advertisers. So a whole set of fundamentally new business models that are now driving the productivity improvement that will enhance the ability to generate faster and stronger income growth and improve standards of living. You all have spent now 2 days looking at a number of different models of organizations who go through these sorts of changes. We've done some similar research looking at the different organizations and the behaviors that they practice, and very different behaviors, whether leading or lagging. But it's really much more about perpetual reinvention over the course of time that's resulting in the incumbent organizations contributing to, in a very strong way, the revival of productivity, which is so important for income growth as we go forward. The second change that we've already begun to see, which is very much a part of the work that we all are doing, but very important as we go forward, is the future of work. It turns out here again, we have a growing body of very useful data to be able to understand the changes in the labor market that we've already begun to see and how workforces are being deployed in a fundamentally different way. So work that we're doing at the IBM MIT Watson lab in AI lab in Cambridge we've been able to look across all of the occupations that exist. There are about 1,000 of them, 965, and through a crowdsourcing method, be able to understand the tasks that make up these occupations. Think of an occupation as consisting of a set of tasks. We're all asked to perform various tasks as part of our occupation. To understand the suitability of those tasks for machine learning. And what the data tell us is that there are a small number of occupations where a large proportion of the tasks are suitable for machine learning. Those are the red bars on the chart. But there are a large number of occupations where a small proportion of the tasks are suitable for machine learning. So that's a future statement. And sometimes you'll hear us say, all work will change. All work will change because, to some degree, some of the tasks that we perform are suitable for machine learning or perhaps even artificial intelligence. Now, the question becomes, how do we assess the trade-off between the displacement effect of automation and the productivity improvement that's going to lead to greater employment and higher wages? The way that we've been thinking about this is, as we think about an occupation, so the blue horizontal bar is an occupation, the small blue vertical bars are tasks. There are a set of tasks that can be displaced through automation, and there are other tasks that in some cases may never be automated. What we find is that when tasks are displaced through automation, there are also tasks that get created as a result of the automation. So it becomes a race between the automation that's occurring and the new tasks that are being created, which create new value for workers. And the balance between the two is what ends up creating new employment and rewarding workers or not. So what we've done is we've gone out and working with our colleagues at Burning Glass, collected 170 million job posts over 8 years. And through the use of artificial intelligence, right, natural language processing, we're able to look at the 170 million job posts and understand that what we see in the data are trends that are quite well understood, which is a comforting thought, right? We want data to be able to tell us a story that we know exists. We've seen this notion of job polarization, where the middle of the job, just the occupational distribution has lost share, and the high skill and the low skill have gained share. Likewise, we find that when we look at the wages that are being offered for these various occupations, as the wages decrease, the share of those tasks increase. So we have essentially what is a negative demand curve. But here's the key point. These mid-wage occupations have lost, over the decade, about 2% of the tasks. 3/4 of them have been gained by low-wage occupations. And 1/4 have been gained by high-wage occupations. So the redistribution of tasks is going 3 times more to low-wage workers than to high-wage workers. But notice this is 2% over 8 years. So it's very small change that's thus far occurred. Not surprising, right? IBM did the Jeopardy competition in 2011, bringing to an end, if you will, the AI winter. And in recent years, we all have begun, I don't want to say struggled, we've all begun to deploy these solutions in our own organizations. So it would be surprising if we've already seen a large impact on the workforce. The impact thus far has been small. But we can tie it back to the suitability for machine learning. In fact, those tasks which are most suitable for machine learning are the same tasks that have a smaller share in the occupations that we're able to look at. But what's important is if you look on the y-axis here, we're talking about very, very small changes that have occurred. Even though the relationship is statistically significant and negative, the coefficient is very weak. It's a very weak set of changes. So we've begun to see the workforce shift and realign as a result of the transformation of the global economy. But we're in the very, very early days of a transformation that's going to occur over a very long term. So we've talked about the historic nature of the transformation, the global economic, political, cultural, social transformation that we're seeing, the impact that it has had on the growth and success of the global economy. Very painful to some extent, transition and transformation that we've gone through. The positive impact that we're now beginning to see in the productivity revival and the very early days of the transformation of the workforce and the impact that it's having on workers. So as I promised, we've got a couple of minutes remaining. Anybody who'd like to debate, argue, or otherwise ask a question. We have a question right up in front here.
Yes, Martin, thank you so much.
That's all right. Everybody else won't be able to hear.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Good stuff. Question on, in the work that we do, we talk a lot about upskilling, transkilling, retraining work. Not to be too harsh about it, but the mean or median IQ on the world means 3.5 billion people live on the left side of the bell curve.
Right.
As these people are displaced, I'm interested in, as you were talking about the race for new tasks coming on, the fundamental intellectual equipment required to engage with those new tasks versus the kinds of equipment that those folks that are being displaced natively have. How do you view that as an impact on that race to keep it in balance?
So I actually think it is really going to be in the interest of lower skilled workers to be able to take advantage of some of the capabilities that are now being created. Artificial intelligence is essentially about helping to make better decisions, better decision making. We all have in our lives the quite simple example. You get on Netflix and it tells you what video you want to watch. You don't have to search for it, and the decision is made. In a business environment, we're providing exactly the same sort of support. In many instances today, maybe in a bit more high-skilled circumstances, physicians and healthcare providers. But over time, these same capabilities are going to be available quite broadly as we all deploy the kind of solutions that we're focused on. That's going to help workers who are less able and may be struggling make better decisions and produce better outcomes. The second point I would make is the demographic point. We have a shortage of workers. So to the extent that we can relieve workers of some of the tasks that they have to perform manually to free up workers to perform other more valuable tasks, that supply side constraint is going to be relieved by the technology as well.
Martin, thank you so much. We did get one question from the app, and it's related to Lee's question. So assume you have the energy, time, and motivation to go back to college. And you probably have a lot of time as chief economist and chief analytics officer of IBM to do that. So assuming you had the time, what would you study to be ready for the new generation of the labor market? What would you study?
Sure. So, of course, the obvious answer is to say data science. But I don't really think that's an adequate or even meaningful answer, because not everybody's interested in being a data scientist. Look, we need workers who are educated and who are skilled, who can read, write, communicate clearly and effectively. And my view is that education in almost any field is going to be of great value to be able to use the tools that are being created through the deployment of artificial intelligence to be better, more effective workers. My advice is always to young people to pursue the areas of interest to them, whether it's poetry or whether it's electrical engineering, and be able to use their skills in the environment and with the tools that we're going to see appear over the course of the next many years. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Martin Fleming. Thank you for being here.
Sure, terrific.